Pierre, hello. I wonder if you could start by introducing yourself. Tell us who you are.
Sure. So I'm a global research scholar at the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia. And I sort of commute virtually between Paris and New York. I've been an energy policy researcher my whole career. I've spent many years at Cambridge, and then I went to a think tank in Singapore and London, and here I am.
And you are perfectly placed, and we're in the right city to reflect on the Paris Accords 5 years later. Mm-hmm. Can you start by telling us what were the Paris Accords?
Oh, yes, indeed. It's actually a very good question, Simon. So the Paris Agreement has been, as you know, hailed as a great success of international climate negotiation. And it was in the sense that most countries signed it. And I think the best way to describe it is to see it basically as a process of weak international supervision of national energy policy. So countries are not mandated to do anything specific by the Paris Agreement. The whole thing is based on voluntary national commitments. And those commitments are then received, if you want, by the international community who sheds a critical eye on them and asks countries in the future to do more. So you've got two parts in the Paris Treaty. You've got the one that everybody talks about, which is this aspiration to keep climate change below 2 degrees or even 1.5, which is really an aspiration, and it's not new, right? I mean, the 2-degree one is certainly not new. It's been around for perhaps 20 years. And then you've got the other part of Paris, which is the really, I would say, the bulk of the treaty itself, of the agreement, which puts in place a framework of voluntary commitments. So it doesn't actually mandate any country to do anything. So that's the system, that's the architecture we are in now. And it's in complete contrast with what we had before, following Kyoto.
So these dozens of countries each make a written commitment, say, I will cut CO2 emissions by X%. Even if you add up all these commitments, these non-binding commitments, they wouldn't quite get us there, would they?
Not only that, which is true, but in a sense it's perhaps even worse, in the sense that countries are not even forced to express their commitments in a given format, okay? So some country can say, okay, I'm going to put in place a lot of solar power, a lot of wind power. Another country will say, I will stop deforestation or slow it down. Another country will say, I will grow my food differently in a more climate-friendly way. So essentially, anything that goes in the right direction can be put in those national commitments. Then how you compare them is very tricky. How you quantify those commitments with a common metric is very difficult.
So a lot of them were just written unquantified?
A lot of that is quantified in its own way. Each country will say, I will do this, X%, X amount. But putting it in a single metric that allows you to compare what countries do is very, very tricky indeed.
Okay, so they made these general promises. The direction of travel was clear. Everyone was supposed to sharply cut CO2. 5 years later, not much progress.
Well, as far as I know, most countries have indeed submitted commitments. And, some of them are meaningful. I mean, perhaps I should, most of them are meaningful. But many people have actually tried to aggregate them and see where they would take us. And they would take us somewhere, not very far below the sort of business as usual scenario, if you want. So, as far, 5 years later, Paris probably has taken us, you know, a little, you know, to some extent in the right direction, but not very far.
You say Paris has taken us in the right direction, but I believe that in 2019, global carbon emissions were higher than in 2015.
Yes, well, the commitments are longer term, right? So you can project, you know, where the commitments would take you. So they, in let's say 10 years' time, we will probably have less emissions than we would have had without these global commitments, if you want. But you know, it's not very, you know, it's not very difficult to understand. It's based on voluntary commitments. So countries will commit to things that are not harmful to them, and they will be risk averse. You know, you know, the cost of renewables goes down and has gone down very significantly. So it's very easy to commit to a lot of renewables if you have favorable conditions for that. It doesn't cost you anything. In some places, it's become the cheapest way to generate electricity. So you commit a lot of that. That counts towards your Paris commitment, but you will. Nobody has committed under Paris to things that actually carry a risk of compromising with economic growth or, you know, social economic development.
So in the Paris Agreement, the eternal truth still held that when a government has to choose between economic growth or environmental improvement, it will always choose economic growth.
Yes, indeed. And this, what you call the eternal truth, is exactly what brought the Kyoto Protocol down. You remember the Kyoto Treaty, which was the previous architecture we had, which was signed in 1997, had in a sense, a much more logical structure than Paris. The idea was you take the carbon budget that the atmosphere can, you know, live with to the end of the century, and you translate that into binding national commitments. And so Kyoto itself started with only the rich countries, and the goal was from 2012 onwards, if I remember well, to bring all the emerging countries into the structure. So, you know, you had a system that was very logical and made a lot of sense in terms of, you know, the arithmetics of the problem at hand, but it proved politically intractable. And the reason it proved politically intractable is exactly what you call the eternal truth, is that countries essentially were asked to commit to emissions reductions, the cost of which they could not know. You know, nobody can know the cost of relative energy technologies 20 years down the line, and the US, therefore, the US Senate refused to ratify Kyoto unless China and other big emerging countries took corresponding commitments, which they were not even supposed to do under Kyoto itself, and emerging countries in any case, you know, very clearly refused to do that, saying, you know, we will reduce later on, and you're responsible for most of the problem in the first hand, but we will never compromise on our social economic development. So these realities have not disappeared. It's just that the Paris Agreement does not immediately force anyone to do anything they wouldn't do anyway.
Okay, so we're now in a situation after Kyoto and Paris that we need to be cutting global emissions, but in fact global emissions have just kept rising, even though renewables are now quite cheap.
Wait a minute, I don't think this is, I wouldn't put it like that. I think this is too strong a statement. You've got several factors that have actually dramatically slowed down the growth of global emissions. One of them is the evolution of China China is moving out of its extremely investment-intensive phase of growth, an extremely materials-intensive phase of growth, steel, cement, all of that, this sort of massive building spree that China went on, which drove its emissions growth. China is coming out of this, and China is responsible for about a third, between a quarter and a third of global emissions, but it has been responsible for most of the growth in global emissions over the past decade, 2 decades. So China is coming out of this, and then the decline in the cost of green energy is changing some very important things. Take India. Just a few years ago, let's say, time is going by, so let's say 10 years ago, India's energy outlooks were really about growing the coal system in line with the demand for electricity. So you had these projections of very rapidly growing CO2 emissions from India. And now India's official energy outlooks do not even, the latest ones, do not see India adding any new coal-fired power plants. And this is a reflection of India's ability to install very, very large amount of solar power and wind power, for which it has excellent conditions. So, the fact that wind and solar have become cheap is not in itself enough to bring emissions down, as we should be doing, but it's already making a very significant difference to the future of global emissions.
And you see, even in the US, where Trump got elected promising to end, quote, the war on coal, coal use has dropped dramatically during the Trump presidency. So coal does seem to be on the way out, replaced by, as you say, by cheaper green fuels.
And in the case of the US, by very cheap natural gas as well.
Yeah. So, we are moving to renewables, but we needed to cut our emissions extraordinarily sharply by 2050 just to hit 2 degrees. Now, we're not on track to do that at all.
No, absolutely not. And if we move the goal, if you want, from 2 to 1.5 degrees, the challenge becomes even more drastic. The latest figures I've seen show that if we want to be, if we want any path towards 1.5 degrees to be achievable, we need to cut emissions globally by 55% in the next 10 years. So more than half in the next decade, which is a gigantic challenge.
We're going to come on to the challenge and how we might possibly try to deal with this in a moment. But it might be even worse than that, mightn't it? Because the IPCC's predictions of climate change have consistently been too conservative. Things have happened faster than their models have predicted.
Okay, I might not go into the physics of it because it's not my field. The thing that people should pay interest to is what climate scientists call the climate sensitivity, which is the amount of warming you get for a given increase in emissions. And it went worse, and recently it seems to be coming better. So, the scientists' views of this have used to become more and more pessimistic, in the sense of more and more warming per given increase in CO2 concentrations. And now the latest I've seen is a bit more optimism. The sensitivity coming down in their modeling of the problem. But that's not my field. And let's take the latest science as like the state of the science. We have to.
Okay, so we need to cut emissions by more than half by 2030 in 10 years.
For 1.5 degrees to be achievable.
Okay, so the good news is that 2 of the major economic powers in the world, the European Union and the US, might be moving in the right direction. The EU is talking about a Green New Deal. Joe Biden as well is talking about that. So Let's take those one by one. Looking at Europe more broadly, not just the Green New Deal plans by the European Union, how good is the trajectory here?
Well, Europe's track record is not impressive, and I'm sorry to say that because it's considered the leader in the fight against climate change. Perhaps it's the leader, but it's not impressive. Nonetheless, the rate of decarbonization of European energy was actually higher when we didn't care about climate change. So when we just had energy policies which were geared to other objectives, we were actually doing better in Europe. And that was a reflection of, to some extent, the French nuclear program, which made a big difference, significant European economy, which totally decarbonized its power system in the 70s and 80s for the most part. It was also a reflection of the massive penetration of natural gas into Europe on the back of the big import contracts with Russia, Algeria, Norway, and that displaced a lot of coal in industry and power generation and home heating as well, and as well as heavy fuel oil in home heating. So these two factors, the nuclear development, the penetration of natural gas, actually led Europe to do better at the time than it's been doing since. So we are just now moving back to rates of decarbonization that we had at the time. So we're the future. We may do better in the future, but we've not been very impressive so far. So now there is a lot going on in Europe. There is very significant investment in renewables, going now into offshore wind with massive industrial developments in this sector. Solar as well, but offshore wind is particularly impressive. There is, in any case, a decline in energy demand in Europe for a variety of reasons, but the deindustrialization of Europe has actually helped it considerably contain the growth of its emission and energy consumption. Some big European economies like the UK have actually had quite impressive success stories in decarbonization of power. The UK has moved very quickly from a system that was basically 45% coal to almost zero coal, and that has made a huge impact on its CO2 emissions. And now you have more difficult nuts to crack. Countries like Poland, which have become a sizable economy in Europe, is very coal dependent, with a lot of issues that you can find in other countries where you have entire regions which depend on coal mining and so on. So Europe is as usual, Europe is a mix of very different realities. Some of them are promising success stories. Some of them show that problems might endure, but in aggregate, Europe's performance in climate policy has not been impressive.
And so now, with the talk of a Green New Deal from Brussels, I mean, how much power does Brussels have to enforce something like that?
Yes, it's a very good question. It's not just the powers that Brussels have versus the competence that governments have kept. It's also a whole approach to public policy in the field of energy. Governments that have done massive things in energy policy historically have not relied on the market to do that, and have not relied on the way we do public policy today, which is by changing the incentives that investors face when they build for-profit projects. You take the French nuclear program; it was entirely a command and control exercise by a very powerful technical bureaucracy that mobilized immense amounts of national savings to do something at scale quickly that totally changed the country's energy supply infrastructure. The way countries like China have done energy in the past 30, 40 years is totally comparable, even if the institutions are different to what I've just described. So Europe has spent decades putting in place a system where energy is now essentially ruled by markets, I would say, and for-profit corporations owned by investors. If you want to achieve a complete transformation in a very specific direction, you probably need to move back to something that is much more directly controlled by public authorities. Then the secondary question is whether that's national governments or the EU. But France could not do its nuclear program today. It would not be legally allowed to do it. So that's something we really need to reflect on.
Yes, and this is not the kind of thing that Brussels ordains. I mean, Brussels is much more about cooperating with member states and finding compromises than instituting a massive new paradigm.
I guess that's right. Brussels has had its own success stories. You know, the carbon market, I mean, some people consider it a failure, but I don't. I mean, I think it's a significant achievement. It has not been as comprehensive as people would have, hoped for. But Brussels, what Brussels is good at, and that's a good example of it, is to, by negotiating with member states, surely, but to change the incentives that investors face, if you want. Okay, so that is the way. That's the modern way of doing public policy. But unfortunately, it's a way of doing public policy that has not proved itself in the climate change field.
So just to finish on Europe, how optimistic are you that we in Europe will massively reduce our emissions?
Unless something changes in the way we do public policy, I'm not very optimistic. The rate of decarbonization is not impressive. The rate of emissions going down is a bit more impressive because energy demand is going down. Okay, we have very mature economies where industry is declining as a share of total GDP, total economic growth. So emissions are going down, but so far I've not been impressed by Europe's ability to do big transformative projects in the field of energy. It's been counterproductive. So Europe has spent a lot of efforts banning long-term contracts in electricity, for example. Those long-term contracts are essential if you want people to be able to finance long-lived infrastructure that essentially substitute capital for fuel. Low carbon infrastructure, nuclear, very big renewable projects. Those need long-term contracts, and Brussels has allowed them for renewables, but it has banned them for everything else, including nuclear. And this is typical of these conflicts in Brussels between market principles and tangible objectives that you want to achieve.
And also, we've reduced our emissions partly by outsourcing them to other countries who now make our stuff.
Absolutely. Outsourcing, a lot of Europe's industry.
Okay, so not a happy picture for Europe. What about the US, which was until China overtook it, the largest carbon emitter, still has a very carbon inefficient economy. But now you have Joe Biden saying, well, let's go for a Green New Deal where we completely retool our economy to make it much less carbon intensive. So can we be optimistic about the US?
Well, we can be excited about what we're hearing from Joe Biden and the people who work for him, certainly, and we should be. The question I've just mentioned for Europe is actually relevant for the US. You know, it's one thing to have big ambitions, and it's another one to relate them to the way people make choices in the economy. So, what are the levers that the federal government really has to transform the US energy infrastructure is one very relevant question. And the other one is, of course, you know, it's a federal system where if you want to do big things, you will have to compensate the relative losers, whether these are states or, you know, communities, industries. And the politics of that can be very tricky, but it's proven in the past to be absolutely essential. And some key positions in the U.S. Congress, even probably after, if Mr. Biden is elected after, and the Senate is won by the Democrats. Key positions in the Senate relevant committees will be held by people coming from very fossil fuel intensive states, and it means that these interests will have to be dealt with one way or another. So, I think I would personally consider it very good news if the US moves out of the Trump doctrine on these things, to some extent denying the science itself, but also unabashedly defending the fossil fuel interests against even against the, I would say, economically sensible aspect of energy and climate policy. So moving out of that is very good for the US if it does, but that's only the beginning of the story. We need to see what the federal government is able to actually implement, given the very decentralized, competitive energy industry of the US, and we need to see what it can do, given all the interest that will have to be compensated for, as those people lose from the energy transition.
Yeah, although on the other hand, there are also liberal states led by California which want to go to much stricter emission standards and could drive things like the auto industry much faster than federal regulations. The US also has a lot of potential for solar, for wind. Solar is already massively expanding there. So
all of that is happening. It's just, it's a question of scale. So you very cheap natural gas has displaced some coal. The rise of solar and wind is actually very impressive. But you're talking about driving, if you want the US to play its part for the world to move towards 1.5 or 2 degrees, you're talking about essentially immediately starting to cut US emissions by 5, 6, 7% a year. So you're talking about, and so it's not just electricity, it's industry, it's transport. You need massive programs of transport electrification. You need massive programs of energy, buildings energy efficiency improvements, which then cut across very entrenched problem in the US of social inequality and so on, spatial inequality, which are in themselves very, very difficult problems. And you need to work across the economy. So, again, market forces, because of these changes in technology, green technologies becoming cheaper, market forces that are themselves taking the US in the right direction. It's the story you were alluding to. Trump promised to stop the decline of coal. He could not do that because coal was not brought down by Obama policies. Coal was brought down by market forces. So you just, market forces are taking the US in the right direction, but market forces will not take US emissions down, 5, 6, 7, 8% a year.
This is what I've been struggling with since I began writing about climate, that we probably are going to move in the right direction. We will move towards a more renewable economy, not just less carbon intensive, but less carbon emitting total. Over in our lifetimes, that is where we're going. But we're going much, much too slowly. And solar and wind are not going to take us there fast enough, partly because it's very hard to supply them on a reliable basis, because what do you do when there's no wind and no sun? It's hard to store them. So it seems to me that the only short-term solution to go to massive reductions without totally crippling the economy, which we might have to do, but the only way to do it without crippling the economy for now is nuclear, just massive nuclear programs. But no country seems to want to follow France and go with nuclear. I mean, is this rational or?
Yes, it's an interesting one. I mean, not only nobody emulates what France did in the 70s and 80s, but France seems to have lost faith in nuclear. And it's not just France. Taiwan and Korea, which were two countries, like heavily industrialized countries that to some extent emulated what France did, they also have lost faith in nuclear power. Actually, China accounts for most of the growth in nuclear generation worldwide, and there's a handful of other countries which are, still build a few. The UK is building new reactors, but it's on a global scale, it's basically about China. What I would agree with is whether you do nuclear or whether you do nuclear as part of something else, what I do agree with is you need governments to do big things, big transformative programs. That's, I think, and you need to do that across the economy, not just electricity. You need to do that across the economy in all countries. That's basically, I think it's a fair representation of what needs to happen if we are to do these 5-6% a year reduction everywhere. You need governments to concentrate the resources of the nation on big transformative programs.
Like insulating homes, building bicycle lanes?
Exactly. Or bicycle lanes, I think you can safely leave aside. It's a very good thing. I'm a keen cyclist, but it's not going to change the world. Insulating homes, yes, very important. And look at France. The COVID recovery program, which was announced in France, which is quantitatively quite important. It has actually, I think it's almost a third, I hope I'm right, of its money, which is earmarked for that. So it's and France is not among the worst, in that already. But the problem has been very well identified. It's just a matter of spending money at it. So you're exactly right. What we need to do, we know. We've known for quite some time. You need to electrify everything you can electrify, and that's most of transport, home heating, water heating, and everything in industry that does not require high temperature, which is a lot of industry, about 70% of industrial energy consumption. Okay, that you need to electrify, and at the same time you bring emissions to zero in the electricity sector. So you decarbonize the electricity sector entirely. But before I go to the rest, just that is a gigantic challenge. It's not going to happen by tweaking around with incentives. You really need to mobilize. You need to mobilize the national energies to do big things that may or may not cost a lot, eventually when we look at them in 100 years' time. But they are sort of epoch, if you want, epoch-defining projects like the nuclear program was in France.
And the good news is that with interest rates negative,
Oh yes.
people paying governments to borrow their money. That's the case for the US, for Germany, for the European Union, which is just issuing its corona bonds. This is the perfect time to invest in a completely new infrastructure.
Absolutely. I could not agree more, and this is a point that needs to really be emphasized. It's the perfect time to do that, and it's actually extremely important because zero carbon infrastructure is all about replacing fuel by capital. You build massive offshore wind farms, you build nuclear power plants, you build new electricity distribution networks that will allow, for managing the intermittency, etc., etc. All of that is extremely capital intensive, but then consumes no fuel or hardly any fuel. So you move from an energy economy that is relatively you move to a new energy economy which is extremely capital intensive. Let's put it like that. So it's very, very relevant that the cost of capital is extremely low. It's a blessing that we would be foolish not to take advantage of.
I'm just going to come back to nuclear once more, because one big shock for nuclear was the accident in Fukushima of the nuclear reactor there in 2011, after which Germany famously did its Energiewende, moved away from nuclear. There was this fear that the collapse of the reactor would cause a rise in cancer, etc. And this has been a fear that has plagued nuclear for decades. How real are these health fears? Are we right to worry about nuclear as a source of disasters and cancer?
Simon, this is not my field of expertise, and this is a supremely sensitive area on which people have very strong views. One way to look at it is to look at the aggregate number of deaths per kilowatt hour. That nuclear has actually generated very few of them, far fewer than most technologies that that are considered much safer, like coal-fired power or even gas-fired power, for that matter. And another way to look at it is the inherent risk that something might actually really go wrong. Like you mentioned Fukushima, but you could have mentioned Chernobyl. Chernobyl went as wrong as it can, and it's a massive disaster which had tremendous human repercussions and environmental repercussions that are still with us today. So how you balance these things, I don't know. I think what France did right, apart from actually making the plants actually work, which some countries did not really do well, but apart from getting the technology right, what France did right is to create a sense of not only acceptance but a sense of pride. Deep in the French countryside, people knew that France had done that and were very proud of it, and so you had this. It was really a national project, and I think that whether you do nuclear or whether you do something else, this is what you need to emulate. You need to build climate change as a national challenge that the nation will rise, that the nation will actually live up to. And actually, Germany and the Energiewende, there is something like that. I think there is an element of that in Germany. They're very proud that Germany has embarked, on this, renewables-based transformation of its energy economy. Maybe it's not gone, as well as people would have hoped so far. But there's an element of what I was alluding to, this sort of national pride that allows government, sort of enables government to do big things and to spend money at problems.
It's seems to me that opponents of nuclear who argue against it on supposed safety grounds, have to look at the number of pollution deaths in our cities, whether that's from coal, mostly in the emerging world, or from diesel in cities like London and Paris, and also think about the deaths that climate change is causing now. For example, farms that are no longer producing anything and will in the future. I'm going to ask you about the future. It seems that the most likely scenarios, we will not do enough to stay below 2 degrees. It's almost inconceivable to me that we would do enough to stay below 2 degrees, because the question of the economy versus the environment is always going to be there, and we know which way governments tend to choose. So if we look a couple of decades ahead and we're going over the 2 degrees, where are our societies going to end up? What is our human existence going to look like?
Well, again, there's a lot of scientific knowledge here that I don't have to answer you precisely. What I'm really interested in is a couple of things. The first one is that the distributive effect of even if not runaway climate change, but a significant degree of climate change will be awful. The poor will suffer disproportionately much more.
Why?
Why? Well, because countries that will be badly impacted tend to be relatively poor in aggregate, and the poor among the poor, such as farmers who live in estuaries and so on, they will be very severely impacted. In rich countries, the poor or relatively poor that live in rich countries, it's also true for them. The relatively affluent will be able to not only improve and adapt their homes to more heat waves and so on, but they will also move to relatively less impacted areas of the country. They will buy more insurance. So you will have something like the healthcare problem in the US, if you want, where the rich are not only the rich, but the sort of upper part of society is very well insured and sort of lives with the risk like other rich people do around the world. But there's a very, very significant fraction of people in the US who are actually badly uninsured. And climate change will replicate that in the US, but globally as well. So that's one thing that interests me. How will our societies, our democratic societies, but also non-democratic ones, by the way, react? In a very interconnected world with 24 hours global news, how will we respond to that? Is one question. And the other question that I think is and you can see it emerging, but I think it's a very, very, very interesting one, is could we see a sort of dramatic collapse, if you want, of the legitimacy of the capitalist system? We in the past 10, 15 years, we've had a number of movements emerging in Europe and also in the US. The latest ones, around the climate strike of young European and then American people, and it's a question for me. I don't know the answer, but it's not inconceivable that this idea that life should be organized around material progress, might actually lose its legitimacy. I don't know. It's really a question, but it would be that would be a very important phenomenon if it happened.
Yeah, and capitalism is very hard to separate from carbon emissions, because we only started to get more prosperous as humans with the Industrial Revolution. That's when economic growth began. Later, life expectancy started to rise dramatically as technology improved. We put that into medicine. So economic growth is emissions, really. That's the way it's been for 200 years. So maybe it will be very difficult for us to have what you call a capitalist system, a system that produces economic growth without emissions?
Well, then we go back to the earlier part of our discussion. You're right. I mean, economic growth has meant fossil fuels. You know, what allowed this dramatic increase in human productivity is the fact that we've discovered ways to exploit this energy which is trapped in carbon that has sort of been there for millions of years. So it started with coal. Well, it actually started with peat, perhaps, which is a sort of unfinished coal. But the big jump came with coal and then oil, natural gas. And by the way, none of that ever declined so far. We've sort of added things up, but there's never been a real energy transition. We've just added things. Even wood. I mean, wood never went back, which is something very, very interesting to notice. So, growth has meant fossil fuels, but I think we know that we can power the world, even a rich world, without fossil fuels. We know that, but it doesn't mean that we will be able to do it. That's very important. We live in social systems. The world is not an engineering system. The world is a system of human systems, and you don't steer human societies as you do with an engineering system, with a physical system. So the fact that we know we can power the world without fossil fuels doesn't mean we are going to achieve it, to do it. And I would be with you on this. Probably not in the time frame that we are given by scientists. Again, to repeat what I said earlier, we will need to, in every country in the world, or most of them, we would need to mobilize durably, sustainably, the energies of the nation on clearly identified big transformative projects in everything from transport, heating, electricity generation, industrial organization. We don't see our societies getting organized for that.
So we're likely not to be able to mitigate the climate. So then we're going to do more adapting to the climate. Individual countries, even individual cities, building dikes, for example, people all over Paris installing air conditioning for the new climate. And then the next step might be geoengineering, that one country, because it's so hard to coordinate internationally, let's say China or the US decides, well, we're going to experiment with a massive parasol, creating a massive parasol over the Earth to reduce heat. So what kind of scenarios do we get into once countries think about geoengineering to cope with the climate crisis?
It's another supremely sensitive area, and it's also actually, there's a lot of secrecy. I'm sure that a lot of research is being done, but not much is done transparently. But there are several aspects of geoengineering that are easy to understand. And one of them is that you don't need international cooperation. So if you have the technical ability to do it, a country that has the ability to do it might actually get a go, at it, try it, because that country would face, let's say, an existential threat from a clearly identified climate-related problem, and they may just try to fix it on their own by shooting mirrors in the space, or whatever it is that they would be doing. But inherently there's no need for cooperation. You don't care what your neighbor does or doesn't do. If you're able to, on your own, to impact the physics of the globe, you may have a go at it. So one of the things that we should be perhaps spending more time on is getting ready with the sort of international legal frameworks for it. How should we respond if a country does that? Wouldn't it be preferable to have some kind of deliberations among countries and do it collaboratively as far as we can, instead of just having our secret programs and finding at the very last minute that this and that country is going to do things that will impact all of us. So I think more thinking is needed in that field, including legally, but also in terms of ethics. Could we have a sort of collaborative thinking process that would sort out what is legitimate to try and what might not be.
Pierre, it's been, I must say, a rather bleak, very clear and convincing, but bleak exposition of where we stand. Let's just, at the end, try to think of some solutions that might work. If you had 1 minute with President Macron and you were able to say, this is what I think you should do for climate, what would you tell him?
I think you pick the easy example. We have an almost decarbonized electricity system in France. So what you need to concentrate on is electrifying transport, electrifying heating, electrifying industry. So I would tell him, reinvigorate the nuclear program. I'm taking risks here, Reinvigorate the nuclear program. Don't bother doing other non-carbon stuff which is less reliable and where France doesn't have real competitive advantage. Reinvigorate the nuclear program, electrify everything you can, and then you will maintain France's leading position in terms of CO2 emissions.
Lastly, I'll try a harder one on you. Let's say you have a minute with President-elect Biden, if he is President-elect, a much more difficult energy situation there. What would you tell him?
I would tell President-elect Biden to tax carbon to a meaningful level and ship all the proceeds from that to coal-intensive states. You buy them off, which would accelerate the demise of coal, and taxing carbon in the US is widely recognized as the most important piece of public policy you can do to steer the country in the right direction.
Well, Pierre Noël, thank you very much.
You're welcome, Simon.